The chandeliers sparkled above the ballroom of the Lancaster Hotel in Manhattan, their light scattering across marble floors polished so bright they reflected every gown and tuxedo. It was the kind of wedding where money was not just spent, but displayed, where champagne flowed like water and violins played without pause. Guests spoke in clipped tones of business mergers, hedge funds, and European estates, yet their eyes were hungry for something else, the spectacle of excess. At the far end of the room, a young woman balanced a silver tray of glasses that trembled slightly with each step she took. Her name was Lila Carter, 22 years old, dressed in a uniform that smelled faintly of starch, though it had been washed too many times to hide the frayed cuffs. She moved between tables with a practiced smile that never reached her eyes. Tonight she was a waitress, invisible to the people she served, except when someone snapped their fingers for another drink or dropped a careless joke about the help. Lila had learned to endure it with silence, to keep her head down, to remember the paycheck that would help pay her mother's prescriptions. The bride and groom were the center of attention, though in truth only one of them seemed fully present. Ethan Lancaster, billionaire, heir and CEO, stood tall in a tailored suit that looked as though it had been stitched onto him. His expression was composed, his eyes cool, his arm loosely around the bride, like a man fulfilling a contract rather than celebrating love. Rumors swirled that the marriage was more alliance than romance, but no one said it aloud. For Ethan, this evening was obligation dressed as celebration. He scanned the room with detached calm until his gaze brushed past Lila and then slid away as if she were nothing more than part of the furniture. Lila moved quietly through the guests until a burst of laughter from one corner froze her steps. A group of wealthy young men and women lounged near the piano, half-drunk eyes glittering with mischief. One of them pointed at her, the words carried over the music, playful and cruel at once. "Why don't you sing for us, waitress? Give us a show." The others joined in, clapping and jeering softly. Their voices grew louder, turning private mockery into public demand. Lila's stomach twisted. She shook her head, murmuring an apology, but they pressed harder, urging her toward the small stage where the microphone waited for the next toast. Guests nearby turned their heads, curiosity rising. The violinists paused, uncertain, the laughter echoing louder in the sudden lull. To the crowd it was amusement, a harmless prank to lighten the evening. To Lila it was a spotlight. She had never wanted a chance for them to laugh at her poverty, her uniform, her very existence. She tried to step back, but one of the men caught her wrist lightly. Not enough to hurt, but enough to trap her, his grin daring her to refuse. A hush fell across the tables closest to them. Someone whispered, "She will never do it." Another voice replied, "Watch, this will be embarrassing." Even the bride looked over her lips, curving in disdain, as if the entire affair were beneath her. Ethan's eyes followed the commotion without interest at first, then narrowed slightly when he saw Lila's pale face. Yet he did not intervene, not yet. Lila's breath came fast, her chest tight. She thought of her mother at home, frail and waiting. She thought of nights she sang softly in their cramped apartment, just to make the silence bearable. She had never sung for strangers, never imagined her voice filling a hall like this. And now they wanted her to perform, only so they could sneer. The microphone stood in the center of the stage, black cord coiled like a snake at its base. Every step toward it would be a surrender to ridicule. Every refusal would mark her as weak. The choice was unbearable. A glass clinked sharply against a spoon. The room shifted attention, focusing entirely on her. "Do it," someone urged. "Let us hear the waitress sing." Lila's throat burned, fear battling something fiercer inside her. She set down the tray carefully, her hands trembling. For a moment she closed her eyes and imagined the sound of her mother's voice, telling her not to let the world make her small. The ballroom waited. Breaths held the air heavy with anticipation. They thought this would be a joke, a passing humiliation. What none of them knew was that a single note from Lila Carter's lips could silence even the cruelest laughter. They thought they were about to watch her stumble, but within minutes the entire hall would be standing in stunned silence, wondering how a poor waitress had carried the power to break open their hearts. Lila Carter's world was not built of marble and chandeliers, but of peeling paint and the steady hum of an old refrigerator that rattled like a broken drum. Her days began before sunrise, lacing up worn sneakers, brushing her mother's hair back from her forehead, whispering a promise that she would bring home enough tips for groceries and medication. The apartment was a 2-bedroom walk, up in Queens, where the wallpaper curled at the corners, and the window frames whistled when the wind pressed too hard. In winter, the heater coughed, but never quite warmed the room, so Lila layered sweaters before heading to her shift. Her mother's illness weighed heavily on her shoulders. Without health insurance, the costs mounted mercilessly, bills stacked in a drawer that she avoided opening. Her mother smiled through the pain, telling her daughter she had the voice of an angel, that one day she should sing on stages instead of scrubbing tables. Lila had once believed it. She had filled notebooks with lyrics, joined the choir in high school, even dreamed of auditioning for a scholarship in music. But when her mother collapsed one evening and the ambulance bill nearly swallowed their savings whole, Lila tucked the dream away. She took the first job she could find at a diner, then at the hotel, where her voice no longer mattered, only her steady hands and practiced smile. Every shift was a test of endurance. Guests left crumbs of cruelty, with their empty plates, remarks about her uniform, her tired eyes, her silence. Yet she swallowed each insult because survival demanded it. And still, when she walked home after midnight, sometimes she hummed softly. Under the streetlights, notes carried away on the wind a secret rebellion against despair. Across the city, Ethan Lancaster lived in a penthouse that pierced the skyline glass walls, offering views of Central Park and the Hudson River. To outsiders, he was a man who had everything: billionaire by inheritance, CEO by expectation, groom by arrangement. His suits were cut to perfection, his name on magazine covers, his life a symbol of wealth. But behind the polished exterior lay scars invisible to the crowd that adored or envied him. Years earlier, he had fallen in love with a woman who saw him not as an heir but as a man. They had planned to escape the rigid demands of his family, but when the press discovered their relationship, her past was twisted into scandal, her reputation shredded. Ethan had been forced by his father to end it publicly, and though he obeyed the decision, left him hollow. She left the city and never looked back, and Ethan never forgave himself. Since then, he moved through life like a machine, fulfilling duties, signing contracts, hiding behind icy composure. When his family arranged a marriage with the daughter of a powerful financier, he accepted with the same resignation He gave to quarterly reports. Love was irrelevant. The wedding was strategy, the bride, a partner in a business alliance. Ethan played his role because rebellion meant war with his family's empire. He carried himself like a man who could not be touched yet inside. He was weary, tired of the emptiness, the endless masquerade of perfection. On the night of the wedding reception, he stood at the center of everything and yet belonged nowhere. His bride smiled for the cameras, their fathers shook hands, and he felt like an actor trapped in a script written by someone else. It was in this fractured space that his world brushed against Lila's. Two lives divided by wealth, yet bound by wounds unseen, collided in a ballroom where laughter turned cruel. For Lila, the humiliation of being singled out threatened to crush her last shred of dignity. For Ethan, watching her struggle, pulled at a place he thought had long since frozen. She represented a raw truth he had forgotten, existed a reminder of voices unfiltered by power or profit. In her eyes he glimpsed defiance wrapped in fear. The same defiance he once carried before compromise stole it away. They were mirrors of each other in different cages, one trapped by poverty, the other by privilege. Neither free, both longing for something more than survival. What the guests saw was only entertainment, a joke at the expense of a waitress. What fate saw was the beginning of a storm that would unravel carefully built illusions. That night, the two worlds did not simply cross, they collided with force setting into motion. A story where wounds would either break them further or bind them together in ways neither could yet imagine. The laughter started small, a ripple that spread quickly across the nearest tables until it swelled into a wave that demanded attention. A young man in a tailored suit, his tie loosened, raised his glass and pointed it toward the waitress with the tired eyes and trembling tray. "Sing for us, sweetheart." He called, his voice dripping with mockery that cut sharper than the clink of crystal. The friends around him chuckled, emboldened by the champagne and the safety of privilege. Their smirks widened as more voices joined in, playful on the surface, yet laced with cruelty. Lila froze her tray, suddenly heavier than stone. She shook her head softly, tried to back away, but they pressed harder. One of the women leaned forward, her sequined dress catching the light, her lips curving in a smile that was anything but kind. "Come on, give us a song. We want to see if the help has talent." Guests nearby perked up, curious whispers darting from table to table. The music faltered as the violinist hesitated, bow poised in mid-air. Sensing the shift in atmosphere, the bride glanced over with thinly veiled disdain, as if the intrusion were beneath her, but not unwelcome as entertainment. Ethan Lancaster stood nearby, his expression unreadable, watching with the detached gaze of a man who had seen too many charades. At first he dismissed it as another trivial amusement of the wealthy, the kind of cruel sport that made him loathe his own world. He turned his attention back to his untouched glass of scotch, but something in the waitress's eyes held him. Fear, yes, but also a stubborn glint, a refusal to collapse, even as the room leaned in to watch her humiliation. Lila's pulse thundered in her ears. She thought of the tray in her hands, of the bills waiting at home, of her mother's fragile smile. She could not afford to make a scene. She set the tray down carefully on a nearby table, her fingers trembling. The men and women around her erupted in cheers, as though they had already won, certain she would stumble into their trap. A man with slicked back hair gestured toward the stage. the microphone standing like a sentinel under the glare of chandeliers. "Take the stage, waitress. Show us what you have got." Lila's throat went dry. The stairs bore into her 1,000 invisible daggers waiting for her to fall. She wanted to run, to disappear into the kitchen, to melt into the floor, but her legs would not move. Instead, she found herself being guided, half pushed, half pulled, until she stood at the edge of the stage. Her shoes felt too small, her breath too shallow. The crowd hushed in anticipation, a cruel kind of silence that promised ridicule. Someone whispered loudly enough to be heard, "This will be embarrassing." Phones appeared lifted into the air, tiny red lights blinking to record her downfall. The bride's smile sharpened her hand, resting on Ethan's arm possessively. Ethan looked down at it, then back at Lila. Something twisted in his chest, though he told himself it was nothing. Lila swallowed hard. The microphone loomed in front of her, the cord curled on the polished floor like a trap. She thought of the nights she sang only for herself, her voice muffled by pillows or drowned out by the hum of the refrigerator. Those songs had been private safe. This was not safe. This was a stage built from malice. The man who had first called her out leaned back in his chair, smirking, certain that the waitress would crumble. He lifted his phone higher, ready to capture every second of her humiliation. Around him, the whispers grew louder. "She will choke. She will freeze. This is going to be good." Ethan's jaw tightened. He felt the weight of their cruelty pressing against the edges of the room. He had spent years drowning in the arrogance of the privileged, yet tonight it seemed more unbearable than ever. His eyes lingered on Lila, her hands shaking her chest, rising with each shallow breath. She looked like a bird forced into flight without wings. For a moment she closed her eyes, as if drawing strength from somewhere unseen. A memory flickered across her mind, her mother's frail voice, urging her never to let the world make her small. The ballroom leaned forward, hungry for a spectacle. They thought they were about to feast on her failure to laugh at the poor waitress who dared step into their arena. None of them imagined that the cruelty they intended as a joke would become the spark that shattered their illusions, that within moments the room would be bound not by laughter, but by silence so complete it would echo louder than applause. The microphone was cold against her fingertips as Lila reached out her hand, trembling like a leaf caught in a storm. The ballroom waited with cruel delight, 100 expectant eyes watching her falter, 100 breaths held not in hope, but in mockery. Her throat burned, her palms slick with sweat, every instinct begging her to run back to the safety of the kitchen where no one could see her. Yet her feet remained rooted, her body frozen in a spotlight she had never asked for. The silence was not kind. It was sharp poised, ready to slice her apart the moment she opened her mouth. A cough echoed from the back. Someone chuckled, and she felt her chest tighten, panic pressing against her ribs. She closed her eyes, and in the darkness behind her eyelids, she saw her mother sitting on the old sofa in their apartment. The hum of the broken heater filling the silence, her voice whispering gently, "You have a gift, baby. Do not let the world take it from you." That memory steadied her breath. When Lila opened her eyes again, she no longer looked at the sea of mocking faces, but at the floor just beyond the microphone, as if anchoring herself to a single point of earth. She inhaled deep and slow and let the first note slip out. It was fragile at first, a wisp of sound that trembled in the air. Some in the audience snickered, nudging each other. But then her voice strengthened. It rose like a tide, carrying with it years of buried sorrow and unspoken dreams. The note swelled clear and pure, echoing against marble and glass, filling the vast room with something it had never held before. A hush fell instantly. Lila's voice wrapped around the words of a song she had carried in her heart for years, one she sang only to herself when nights were too heavy. The melody was raw, unpolished, yet drenched in truth. Each word seemed pulled from the deepest part of her, every syllable, trembling with pain and resilience. The laughter that had threatened to drown her fell silent, smothered by the undeniable force of authenticity. A woman in the second row lowered her phone slowly, her lips parted, eyes glassy. The man who had taunted her leaned forward, confusion flickering across his features, his smirk dissolving. By the second verse, the room was still as if time itself bowed to listen. Lila's voice soared higher, breaking through the gilded arrogance of the ballroom, slicing through the masks of wealth and pretense. She was not singing for them. She was singing for herself, for her mother, for every night she had swallowed her song to survive. The sound carried her grief, her hope, her defiance, and it demanded to be heard. Ethan felt his chest constrict, as though a dam inside him had cracked. He had listened to the greatest sopranos in world-renowned halls, voices trained to perfection, but none of them had ever touched him like this. This was not technique. This was truth. Each note seemed to strike a chord long buried in him, stirring memories of a love lost of freedom, stolen of a self he had abandoned. He could not look away from her. For the first time in years, his icy composure faltered. His hand tightened around his glass until his knuckles whitened, his breath caught in his throat. The bride beside him shifted uncomfortably, sensing the shift. But Ethan no longer noticed her. His gaze was fixed entirely on the waitress, whose song was rewriting the night. Lila's eyes opened briefly, scanning the crowd, and for a fleeting moment they locked with Ethan's. In that glance, something unspoken passed between them, a recognition, a spark of kindred wounds. Then her gaze moved on, but the impact remained searing into him, like fire through ice. The song reached its climax, her voice trembling yet unyielding as she poured out the last of her strength. Her chest heaved, her eyes shone with unshed tears, but the sound did not waver. It climbed higher, a plea, a cry, a declaration that she existed, that her voice mattered even in a room that had wanted her small. By the final note, the entire ballroom was transfixed. The chandeliers seemed dimmer compared to the light radiating from her courage. Silence hung heavy after the last echo faded, a silence so deep it roared in every ear. Then slowly one pair of hands began to clap. Another joined, and suddenly the room erupted in thunderous applause. People rose from their chairs, overcome clapping, as if compelled by something greater than etiquette. Tears glistened in the eyes of strangers who had never known her name minutes before. The cruel laughter that had summoned her to the stage was gone, replaced by reverence, by awe. Lila stood trembling, breathless, unsure what to do. She had not sung for applause. She had sung because she had no choice, because silence would have broken her more than their ridicule. Now the applause rolled over her like a wave, disorienting, overwhelming. She lowered the microphone slowly, her hands shaking. She did not bow, did not smile. She simply stood stunned, as if waking from a dream she had not dared to dream. Ethan was on his feet before he realized it, clapping hard, his gaze fixed on her. His heart pounded with something unfamiliar yet undeniable. The walls around him cracked wider with every beat. This was not entertainment. This was revelation. Across the room, the bride forced a smile, her knuckles white against the stem of her glass. Guests whispered feverishly, phones forgotten conversations charged with awe. But no one dared approach the stage yet. For in that moment, the poor waitress they had tried to humiliate had become untouchable, her song lifting her beyond their reach. And Ethan Lancaster, billionaire groom, bound by duty, realized with startling clarity that a single voice had done what wealth and power never could. It had awakened him. When the last echo of her voice dissolved into the air and the applause finally began to fade, Lila stepped down from the stage, with her heart still hammering like a drum in her chest. She wanted nothing more than to disappear into the kitchen, to hide from the eyes that had once mocked her and now stared at her as though she had become something otherworldly. She pushed through the crowd with her head low, clutching the tray she had abandoned earlier, hoping no one would stop her. But Ethan Lancaster was already moving. He excused himself from the bride's side, ignoring her startled protest, and slipped through the sea of tuxedos and gowns, until he found himself standing only a few feet away from the girl who had just undone the walls he had built around his heart. Lila nearly dropped the tray when she saw him blocking her path. His presence was overwhelming, the kind that filled a room without effort. His suit was flawless, his expression as composed as ever. Yet there was a spark in his eyes that unsettled her. She braced for scorn, for dismissal, for the cold cruelty she expected from men like him. Instead, his voice came low, steady, carrying something she did not anticipate. That was extraordinary. She blinked, unsure if she had heard correctly. Her first instinct was disbelief. Surely he was mocking her like the others had. She shook her head, muttering an apology for the disruption, but he stepped closer. "I mean it," he said, his gaze fixed on her, as though he could see past the uniform, past the exhaustion, into the soul she had revealed in her song. "No one in that room has ever silenced me, not once until you." Lila's breath caught. Compliments were dangerous. Hope was dangerous. She had spent years learning not to believe kind words because they so often carried hidden daggers. She mumbled that she needed to return to work. But Ethan did not move aside. His eyes softened, and for a fleeting moment, the mask of the billionaire vanished, leaving only a man who looked achingly human. "What is your name?" he asked. She hesitated, every instinct screaming to keep her world separate from his. But the truth slipped out anyway. "Lila." He repeated it quietly, as if testing the shape of it on his tongue. "Lila." It suited the melody he had just heard, delicate yet strong. Before she could retreat further, a voice called out for him. The bride, her tone sharp with irritation, demanded his return. Guests were already whispering about why the groom had left her side. Ethan glanced back briefly, then turned to Lila once more. "Thank you," he said simply, his eyes lingering on her with an intensity that made her chest ache. Then he stepped away, resuming his place beside the woman he was expected to marry, his face once again unreadable. Lila hurried into the kitchen, her pulse still racing, the echo of his voice haunting her. She told herself it meant nothing. A billionaire had noticed her for a second because of a song. Tomorrow he would forget, and she would still be a waitress, struggling to survive. Yet when she lay in bed that night, staring at the cracked ceiling of her apartment, she could not erase the memory of his eyes when he had said her name. Across the city, Ethan stood on the balcony of his penthouse. The glittering skyline spread out before him. His bride slept in a guest room, a formality more than a relationship. He held a glass of whiskey in his hand, but barely touched it. All he could hear was Lila's voice, replaying in his mind like a secret he could not shake. For years he had been untouched by music, by art, by anything that tried to stir emotion. Tonight, a poor waitress had broken through the armor he thought indestructible. He wondered if he would ever see her again. He told himself he should let it go, that it was foolish to dwell on a woman whose world was so far from his own. Yet deep down he knew he would not be able to. That connection, brief as it had been, was too real, too raw. For the first time in years, Ethan Lancaster lay awake, not because of deals or obligations, but because of a voice that reminded him he was still alive. And for the first time in years, Lila Carter allowed herself to dream not of wealth or escape, but of a man who had seen her not as a joke, not as a servant, but as someone worth listening to. Neither of them understood it fully yet, but a spark had been lit, and no matter how much they tried to deny it, the fire would grow. Days passed after the wedding, but the memory of that night clung to Ethan like a shadow he could not shake. Board meetings blurred, stock reports piled on his desk, yet all he heard when silence fell was the sound of her voice cutting through marble and gold. He told himself it was ridiculous that a billionaire groom should not be haunted by a waitress. But the more he tried to bury the thought, the more insistent it became. One evening after another dinner where his bride spoke of investments and gala schedules with the precision of a banker, Ethan excused himself and found his driver waiting. He gave an address he had memorized from the employee roster he had quietly requested. Queens, an old neighborhood where the streets were lined with tired apartment blocks and corner stores that stayed open past midnight. He sat in the car outside, watching light spill from one cracked window. A silhouette moved inside, slight and graceful, humming, faintly as though unaware anyone might be listening. Ethan did not knock that night, but he returned again the next evening. This time he stepped out walking the block until he found her leaving for a late shift at the diner she had taken after being dismissed from the hotel. She stopped short when she saw him standing by the lamppost, his suit out of place under the buzzing neon. "What are you doing here?" she asked, suspicion, sharpening her tone. "I wanted to talk." He admitted his honesty, disarming even himself. She frowned, glancing at the cracked sidewalk, the night air heavy with the smell of fried food from the diner. "We have nothing to talk about. You are a groom, I am a waitress. That is the end of it." But he did not move. "Just 5 minutes," he said quietly. "Please." Against her better judgment, she agreed, perhaps out of curiosity, perhaps out of exhaustion from always being invisible. They sat at a small cafe nearby, its chipped tables and flickering lights a world apart from the Lancaster ballroom. Ethan removed his jacket, rolled up his sleeves, trying to look less like the man whose name was printed on magazine covers. For the first time in years, he spoke without rehearsed lines. "I meant what I said." That night he told her, "Your voice was extraordinary." Lila shook her head, sipping from a chipped mug of coffee. "You do not understand. That was not courage. That was desperation. I sang because if I had not, I would have drowned in their laughter. He watched her carefully, the honesty in her words cutting deeper than any performance. "You think that is less than courage?" he asked. She looked away, her eyes catching the glow of the street lamp. "My mother is sick," she whispered. "I sing for her when the medicine is not enough to ease the pain. That is all." Ethan felt the weight of her confession settle on him. He thought of his own mother long gone and of the emptiness that had followed. He wanted to tell her that he understood that survival often forced people to hide their gifts, but he simply nodded. That night ended without promises. She left for her shift, and he returned to his penthouse. Yet the meetings continued. Sometimes he waited for her after work, offering to walk her home. Sometimes she allowed him inside, where the apartment smelled faintly of lavender from an old candle, and the furniture sagged with age. She would brew tea in mismatched cups, while he sat at the kitchen table, listening to her hum quietly as she moved. In those moments, Ethan felt more alive than in any boardroom or ballroom. Lila was wary, always reminding herself that he belonged to a world that would crush hers without hesitation. But slowly, against her will, she began to look forward to his visits. He listened when she spoke. He did not interrupt, did not treat her words as trivial. One rainy afternoon, he found her sketching lyrics in a battered notebook. She flushed, trying to hide it, but he reached gently and asked to read. The words were simple, raw lines about struggle and hope. He read them aloud softly, and she felt heat rise in her cheeks. "You have something rare," he said. "Do not hide it." She wanted to laugh at the absurdity. A billionaire telling a waitress not to hide. But his eyes held no mockery, only sincerity, and for the first time she allowed herself to believe him. Their meetings remained secret, tucked into corners of the city, where no camera dared to look. Each encounter wove another thread between them, fragile yet unbreakable. She learned that beneath his cold exterior was a man, scarred by loss, tired of a life lived for others. He learned that beneath her quiet humility was strength fierce enough to withstand ridicule and hardship. They were two broken souls finding pieces of themselves reflected in the other. Yet every time they parted, reality intruded. He still wore the title of groom, bound by obligation. She still returned to a home where medical bills crowded the table. Their connection was undeniable, but dangerous, a fire hidden in the dark. And though neither spoke it aloud, they both knew the world would not stay blind forever. Whispers always traveled fastest among the wealthy, and soon the murmurs began. At first it was only faint suspicion, a few raised brows, when Ethan was seen slipping out of board dinners. Early a few sharp looks when he lingered too long in neighborhoods no Lancaster should ever set foot in. But gossip had a way of multiplying, and within weeks the story had taken on a life of its own. The groom who had seemed so detached at his wedding was rumored to be distracted by someone else. The name was not known, not yet, but the idea was enough to unsettle the circles of power. Lila noticed the shift before Ethan did. One evening she found her manager unusually tense, whispering that customers had asked about her, that someone with too fine a suit for the diner had come by earlier asking questions. Her stomach twisted with dread. She knew the secret meetings could not stay secret forever, but she had not expected the eyes of his world to turn toward her so soon. Ethan brushed it off when she told him, insisting he would handle it. But even he could not ignore the sharp warning from his father, delivered in a voice that carried decades of command. "You are engaged, Ethan. Do not disgrace this family by chasing some girl from the gutter." The bride herself, Caroline, cornered him during a charity gala, her smile brittle as glass. "Do you think people are not watching?" she hissed. "You are mine whether you like it or not." Ethan's jaw tightened, his eyes icy, but he said nothing. He had been raised to endure, to fulfill, to carry the burden of duty. Yet when he saw Lila again, standing outside the cafe, with rain plastering her hair to her cheeks, he felt the weight of those chains more than ever. She sensed it too. "You should not be here," she whispered, her arms crossed tightly against the chill. "They are already talking. It will ruin you." He shook his head, stepping closer, the rain running down his face. "You think I care about their whispers." She laughed bitterly, though there was no humor in it. "You should. Your company, your reputation, your family. They all depend on it. You belong to them. I am just a waitress with bills I cannot pay." Ethan felt her words pierce through him, not because they were wrong, but because they were true. He had been raised to belong to his family's empire, to marry for power, to live without choice. And yet here he was standing in the rain, desperate for a woman who wanted nothing from him but honesty. That night ended in silence, both of them walking away with hearts heavy. For the first time, Ethan tried to convince himself that letting her go was the only way to protect her, to protect both of them. He threw himself back into work, attending every event, keeping Caroline at his side, wearing the mask of a dutiful groom. But the mask cracked when he caught his reflection in the mirror. His eyes no longer looked like his own. Lila, too, tried to retreat into her world. She worked double shifts, avoided the places they used to meet, told herself it had been a mistake to let him close. But every song she hummed at night carried his face in her mind, and every silence between customers felt like an ache she could not shake. The first layer of conflict had revealed itself. The whispers were no longer background noise. They were warnings, threats, reminders that their worlds were never meant to intertwine. Ethan began to notice reporters lingering near his office, their questions sharper. Caroline paraded him through social functions with a grip on his arm that felt more like shackles. His father's words echoed daily, cold and unforgiving, yet none of it silenced the memory of a waitress standing under chandeliers, her voice breaking him open. He knew he was at war with himself. On one side was a duty, honor, and the empire he had been born to protect. On the other side was the truth of his heart, fragile yet fierce, embodied by a woman who had nothing but her song. And though he told himself he would choose duty each day that passed, made the lie harder to hold. The storm broke quietly at first, not with thunder but with the rustle of newspapers and the glow of headlines across digital screens. A photograph appeared of Ethan Lancaster, stepping out of a cafe in Queens, his expression unguarded, his gaze lingering too long on the girl beside him. The girl was Lila, her waitress uniform unmistakable, her smile shy and fleeting. The tabloids seized it like wolves. Billionaire Groom spotted with mystery waitress. The whispers that had haunted them became accusations, and by morning the Lancaster family was in uproar. Ethan's father called him into the study, the walls lined with portraits of ancestors who had never known scandal. His voice thundered with restrained fury. "Do you realize what you have done? This family's name is currency, and you have just set it on fire." Ethan stood tall, but his chest was tight. "I did nothing wrong," he said, but the words sounded weak even to him. His father slammed his hand on the desk. "You are engaged to Caroline. This alliance holds contracts worth billions. Do you think the board will stand by while you ruin us for a fling with a waitress?" Ethan did not flinch, though the word stung. "She is not a fling." His father's eyes narrowed. "She is nothing, and you will end this now." Meanwhile, Lila faced her own reckoning. The manager at the diner pulled her aside, his face pale with discomfort. "I am sorry, Lila, but we cannot keep you here. Customers are complaining. Reporters are waiting outside. It is not safe." She tried to argue, but her voice broke. By the end of the shift, she was unemployed. Her apron folded in her arms, her dignity fraying at the edges. When she returned home, she found strangers lingering near her building, photographers shouting questions, neighbors whispering. Her mother sat trembling in the living room, confused and frightened by the sudden intrusion. Lila's heart shattered. This was not the life she wanted for her mother. Ethan came that night, his expression raw with guilt when he saw the fear in her mother's eyes. "I am sorry," he whispered. "This is my fault." Lila shook her head, her voice sharp with pain. "No, it is mine. I should never have let this happen. You belong to a world that will destroy me without blinking, and I cannot drag my mother through it." Ethan reached for her hand, but she pulled away. "They will never stop," she said. "Your father, your bride, the press, they will tear us apart until there is nothing left." He pleaded with her, his words fierce. "I will fight them. I will give it all up if I have to." But she shook her head, tears spilling down her cheeks. "Do not. You will lose everything, and I will not be the reason for it." For a long moment they stood in silence, the distance between them heavier than chains. Then Lila made the choice that broke her. She told him it was over. Her voice was quiet, steady, though her heart screamed in protest. "Go back to your world, Ethan. Forget me." He tried to argue, but her resolve was iron. She turned her back to him, her shoulders shaking, but her words final. "Please leave." Ethan left that night with rain falling hard against the pavement, his chest hollow, his hands clenched into fists. In the car he felt the weight of defeat, the echo of every sacrifice demanded by his family. Lila collapsed onto her bed, clutching her mother's hand, sobbing quietly so as not to scare her further. She told herself it was for the best, that protecting him and her mother mattered more than her own happiness. Yet deep inside, she knew she had carved out her own heart and handed it away. The betrayal was not his. It was hers against her own longing. The sacrifice tasted like ashes, and neither of them slept that night. Across the city, two broken souls lay awake, separated by duty and fear, bound by a love neither could deny, yet both had chosen to destroy. Ethan tried to bury himself in duty, to drown in contracts and conferences, to silence the ache with the cold hum of boardrooms. For days he played the part of obedient son and dutiful fiancé. His hand on Caroline's arm at charity dinners, his lips pressed into polite smiles for cameras. But inside he was crumbling. Every word she spoke felt like sandpaper against his skin. Every toast and handshake like shackles tightening around his wrists. He told himself Lila was safer without him, that she was right to cut him off, that he should honor her sacrifice. But when he closed his eyes, he saw her standing under chandeliers, her voice breaking his walls. He felt her trembling hand in his, the taste of what life could be if he dared to claim it. The emptiness became unbearable. On the 7th night, he sat alone in his penthouse, staring at the skyline that mocked him with its perfection. Rain lashed against the glass walls, a storm that mirrored the chaos inside him. He poured whiskey, but could not drink it. He loosened his tie, but could not breathe. His mind slipped back to years earlier, to the woman he once loved and lost because he had obeyed. He remembered her pleading eyes as he walked away, the way the press devoured her, the way she disappeared. He had chosen duty then, and it had left him hollow. Now history was repeating, and he felt it crushing his chest. He stood abruptly, storming out into the night, his driver startled by the sudden order. "Queen's Ethan," said his voice sharp. The car sliced through sheets of rain headlights, carving narrow paths through the darkness. Ethan sat rigid in the back seat. His fists clenched, his pulse a drumbeat of desperation. When the car stopped in front of Lila's building, he stepped out without an umbrella, letting the storm soak him. He climbed the steps 2 at a time and pounded on her door until she opened it. She stood in the doorway, hair-damp eyes wide with shock at the sight of him, drenched and shaking. "Ethan, what are you doing here?" she whispered, her voice trembling. He looked at her as though she were the only truth left in the world. "I cannot do it, Lila. I cannot pretend anymore. I try to be what they want, but I am dying inside. You are the only thing that makes me feel alive." She shook her head, tears springing to her eyes. "You cannot say that. You belong to someone else, to something else. You have a fiancé, a family, an empire. And I cannot survive being dragged into your storm." He stepped closer, his voice breaking. "I lost someone once because I listened to them. I will not lose you too. I do not care about the contracts or the gossip. None of it matters if I do not have you." Lila's chest heaved as she tried to steady herself, her heart warring with fear. "You do not understand," she whispered. "They have already ruined my job. They harass my mother. I cannot let them destroy us both." Ethan reached for her hands, his own shaking. "Look at me, Lila. Look at me." She met his gaze, and in his eyes she saw no mask, no billionaire, no groom. She saw a man stripped raw, desperate, and sincere. "You are the only person who has ever seen me," he said. "You are the only one who makes me want to fight. Please do not walk away." The rain pounded against the building, thunder rumbling like the echo of their turmoil. For a long moment she said nothing, torn between love and fear, between desire and duty. Then she whispered, broken but true, "I love you, Ethan. I always have." His breath caught relief flooding him, but before he could speak, she pulled back, her voice fierce. "But love is not enough, not against them." His face twisted with anguish. "Then I will make it enough. I will tear it all down if I must." She shook her head, her tears mixing with rain, blown in from the open door. "You cannot. They will crush you." He stepped forward, pulling her into his arms despite her resistance. She felt the heat of his body, the desperation in his embrace. His voice cracked against her ear. "I would rather be crushed with you than live a lifetime without you." In that embrace, something inside her cracked too. She clung to him, sobbing, knowing that this was the breaking point. They could no longer deny what bound them, nor could they escape the cost. The storm outside raged, but within that small apartment, 2 hearts beat against the tide, defiant even as the world pressed in. The morning after the storm, Ethan arrived at the Lancaster headquarters with his hair still damp and his jaw set like stone. Board members filled the conference room, their faces masks of disapproval, their voices sharp with warning. Newspapers lay, scattered across the polished mahogany table, each headline screaming scandal. Billionaire Groom's secret mistress, Lancaster legacy at risk. The accusations cut deep, yet Ethan felt strangely calm. He had reached the point where fear no longer mattered. His father's voice thundered from the head of the table. "You will end this nonsense now. You will make a public statement denying everything and reaffirm your commitment to Caroline." Ethan stood tall, his gaze steady, his voice clear. "No." Gasps rippled through the room. His father's eyes blazed. "Do you realize what you are throwing away? Contracts worth billions, alliances forged over generations. You are choosing a girl who has nothing over an empire built on our name." Ethan's voice did not falter. "I am choosing myself. For years I have lived for this family, for appearances, for deals that hollowed me out. I will not sacrifice her to keep pretending." One of the board members sputtered, "You will destroy us." Ethan's lips curved in the faintest smile. Then perhaps it deserves to fall. He walked out before they could respond, leaving chaos in his wake. Caroline confronted him later that evening, her fury sharp enough to wound. "You humiliate me," she hissed, her nails digging into his arm. "Do you think the world will forgive you for leaving me at the altar?" Ethan's expression hardened. "There is no altar, Caroline, not for us." She stared at him in disbelief, her pride collapsing into rage. "You will regret this." He turned away unshaken. Outside, the cameras swarmed their shouts like a storm of vultures. Ethan faced them without flinching. He gave a single statement, his voice carrying with the weight of truth. "I will not marry Caroline. I will not live a lie for contracts or power. The woman I love deserves better, and so do I." The city erupted. Social media exploded, with debates half the world condemning him for betrayal, the other half praising his courage. Stocks dipped, investors panicked. But Ethan felt lighter than he had in years. For once he was free of the chains his family had forged, yet freedom came with cost. Lila watched the coverage from her small living room, her mother's hand resting gently on hers. Her chest ached as Ethan spoke, as his eyes, steady and unashamed, declared love without naming her. She wanted to run to him, to thank him, to hold him, but fear lingered. She knew the storm had only grown worse. That evening, Ethan arrived at her door, his suit rumpled, his tie discarded, his face tired but resolute. "They will come after me harder now," he admitted, his voice hoarse. "They will drag my name, freeze my assets, maybe even cut me off. But I do not care. I meant what I said. You are worth more than all of it." Lila shook her head, tears welling in her eyes. "I never asked you to do this. I never wanted to be the reason you lost everything." He stepped closer, cupping her face with trembling hands. "You are not the reason. You are the only reason I found the strength to stop lying." She broke then, collapsing into his arms, her sobs muffled against his chest. He held her tightly, his own tears falling freely for the first time in years. It was not victory, it was not peace, but it was truth, and truth was worth every loss. The days that followed were brutal. Reporters camped outside her building. Tabloids splashed her picture across pages with cruel captions. The Lancaster family issued statements condemning Ethan, cutting ties, disowning him publicly. Yet through it all, he stood by her side, walking her through crowds of flashing cameras, with his hand firm around hers. Lila trembled at the weight of the spotlight, but when she looked up at him, she saw no doubt. And slowly, she began to believe they might survive this storm together. The courage to defy had cost Ethan everything he was born to inherit, but in its place, he had found something that could never be bought: the freedom to love openly, fiercely, without shame. The scandal might have ended her quietly if Lila had let it, but music refused to die inside her. After the headlines faded into another cycle of society gossip, she found herself restless, aching with a voice that demanded to be heard again. Ethan noticed it first, the way her fingers traced invisible notes on the table, the way she hummed under her breath. When she thought no one was listening, he encouraged her, gently suggesting open mic nights at small cafes far from the gleam of his name. At first, she resisted, terrified that stepping back onto a stage would invite ridicule. But one evening she walked into a dimly lit bar tucked into a forgotten corner of Brooklyn. The room smelled of beer and hope. A dozen people scattered across tables, a microphone standing lonely at the front. When she sang, there were no chandeliers, no gowns, no billionaires waiting to laugh. There were only strangers who looked up from their drinks, surprised by the raw beauty spilling from a girl who seemed too shy to own it. The applause was not thunderous, but it was real, and when Ethan took her hand afterward, she felt the first spark of belief. From there, the journey unfolded slowly, step by step, not with the sudden leap of a fairy tale, but with the steady rhythm of resilience. She sang at community centers, at small charity events, sometimes for free, sometimes for little more than enough to buy groceries. Her voice carried through church halls and neighborhood gatherings, touching people who had never seen a headline about her. Videos began to surface, shaky recordings posted online with captions like "Waitress with the golden voice" or "You need to hear her sing." They spread quietly at first, shared among friends, then climbing into wider circles. Comments poured in from strangers across the country, people who said her voice reminded them of lost loves, of battles fought, of mornings they thought they would not survive. Each message became fuel, reminding her that music was not about fame, but about connection. Ethan attended every performance he could, slipping into back rows with his cap pulled low, clapping louder than anyone. Sometimes he drove her to rehearsals, waiting patiently in the car with files on his lap, pretending to work, but listening to her voice drifting through the walls. Other times he sat in the front row, his presence a steady anchor when nerves threatened to overwhelm her. He never pushed, never tried to shape her path, only reminded her that she was enough as she was. Lila's confidence grew. She began writing her own songs again, dusting off the battered notebook that had once held secret verses. Ethan read them with reverence, marveling at the honesty in her words, the courage to turn wounds into melodies. He told her that her songs had more power than any fortune, and slowly she began to believe him. With the time, invitations came from larger venues, not grand theaters, but respected stages where aspiring artists fought for slots. She sang under soft spotlights, her voice trembling at first, but finding strength with each note. Reviews trickled in from local papers, describing her as a rising star with a voice that carried both fragility and fire. Lila was careful, never letting ambition devour her humility. She still worked shifts when she could, still cared for her mother, still remembered the nights of hunger and ridicule. She told herself she would never forget where she came from, because that was where her songs drew their truth. Yet she also began to feel something new pride. She was not just surviving anymore. She was creating. Ethan watched her transformation with awe. The woman who had once shaken under cruel laughter now stood on stages with her head high, her voice silencing rooms, not because they wanted to mock her, but because they needed to hear her. He saw how people leaned forward, how strangers closed their eyes and let her notes carry them. He knew she was becoming what she was meant to be, and though his own life had been stripped of luxury, he felt richer than ever. Of course, there were still battles. Reporters tried to twist her story, critics sneered that she was only known because of Ethan. She faced hecklers in bars nights when her voice cracked mornings when exhaustion made her want to give up. But each time she faltered, she remembered the ballroom the night she turned mockery into silence, and she remembered Ethan's eyes reminding her she was more than they believed. Slowly, the music carried her further. A video of her original song, recorded on a borrowed phone at a community concert, went viral. Within weeks, it had hundreds of thousands of views. Emails flooded in from producers and managers, though she hesitated, wary of losing her authenticity. Ethan urged caution, reminding her that her gift was not for sale, but he also told her she deserved to be heard on the largest stages. For the first time, she allowed herself to dream of a career in music not as fantasy, but as possible reality. Her mother's health remained fragile, but every time she watched her daughter sing, her eyes lit with pride that medicine could not dim. One evening after a small concert, Lila sat with Ethan on the steps outside her hair. Damp with sweat, her notebook clutched against her chest. She whispered that she was scared, that success might change her, that she was not sure she belonged in the world that wanted to claim her voice. Ethan brushed a strand of hair from her cheek and said softly, "You do not need to belong to their world. Let them belong to yours." She looked at him, tears shining, and realized that he was right. Her journey was not about proving herself to the wealthy or the critics. It was about giving her truth to anyone willing to listen. The music would carry her not because she sought fame, but because she could not stop singing. And with Ethan by her side, she no longer felt alone. Ethan Lancaster no longer walked the marble halls of his family's empire. The board had replaced him, the fortune had slipped from his grasp, and society circles whispered about his fall from grace with the same relish they once reserved for his triumphs. Yet he did not regret a single choice. For the first time in his life, he woke each morning without chains, his heart beating for something real. He poured his energy into rebuilding on his own terms, investing in smaller companies, mentoring young entrepreneurs, and living without the suffocating weight of a dynasty that had measured him only by numbers. It was not easy. Some days were lean, and others tested his patience. But freedom tasted sweeter than any privilege he had ever known. Beside him, Lila blossomed. Her music, once hidden in notebooks and whispered in the dark, now flowed openly into the world. The viral video had brought invitations, but she chose carefully guided, not by fame, but by authenticity. She performed at community events, at theaters that welcomed her truth, and eventually on stages that filled with thousands of people who came not because she was attached to a billionaire scandal, but because her songs had touched their souls. Each performance carried echoes of her journey, From the cruel laughter of the ballroom to the quiet strength of nights spent caring for her mother, she sang of resilience, of love that defied expectation, of voices that refused to be silenced. Audiences wept, applauded, and rose to their feet, not because she was perfect, but because she was real. Ethan attended whenever he could, sitting in the crowd with pride burning in his chest. He did not stand in the spotlight, did not seek attention, but every time her eyes found him across a crowded room, he knew she carried him in her song. Their love had weathered storms that could have broken them. There were moments of doubt when Lila feared that the world would always see her as the waitress who stole a groom, and moments when Ethan wondered if he could ever escape the shadow of his name. But each time they faltered, they chose each other again. They built a life not on wealth or contracts, but on quiet mornings and shared dreams. Lila's mother, though still fragile, lived to see her daughter's voice celebrated. She sat proudly in the front row at concerts, her smile soft, her eyes shining, with the knowledge that the girl who once sang to ease her pain now sang to heal countless others. In her mother's joy, Lila found strength. Years passed, and though society never forgot the scandal, its sting faded. The Lancasters rebuilt their empire without Ethan, but their victory felt hollow compared to the freedom he carried. Caroline married another heir, her name tied to contracts rather than love, and the world moved on as it always did, leaving only those who had chosen truth to stand firm. The climax of Lila's journey came one evening in a grand concert hall, the seats filled to the rafters, the stage lit by a soft golden glow. She stepped into the light, wearing a simple dress, her hair falling freely, her notebook of songs now transformed into albums cherished across the country. The crowd hushed as she began to sing, her voice steady, soaring, carrying with it every step of her story. She sang of pain and laughter, of sacrifice and courage, of a love that had been mocked but endured. The final note lingered in the air like a prayer, and the audience erupted, rising to their feet in a wave of applause that shook the walls. In the front row, Ethan stood, his eyes locked on hers, his hands clapping until they stung. Their gazes met, and in that moment, the noise of the crowd fell away. They saw only each other, the billionaire who had given up his empire, and the waitress who had found her voice. The world had once tried to keep them apart, but here they were stronger than the chains that bound them. After the concert, Lila walked off stage to find Ethan waiting in the wings. He held out his hand, his eyes shining with pride. "You were magnificent," he whispered. She smiled, her voice soft but sure. "We were magnificent, together." They embraced, and the world outside seemed to fade. This was not the ending of a fairy tale, but the beginning of a life built on truth. A life that would hold new challenges, new storms, but also a love that had been tested and proven unbreakable. As they stepped into the night, hand in hand, Lila looked up at the sky. For so long she had believed her voice would remain hidden, her dreams buried under survival. But now her song echoed far beyond what she had ever imagined, carrying with it the proof that even the smallest voice could change everything. Ethan kissed her forehead, his heart steady. Once he had been a groom, trapped in duty, a billionaire, chained by family expectations. Now he was simply a man in love, free at last. And together they walked forward, their hearts aligned, their futures intertwined, knowing that love had given them the courage to defy the world and the strength to build one of their own. At its heart, the story of Lila and Ethan is not simply about a poor waitress and a billionaire groom. It is about the courage to defy the roles the world writes for us. Lila was meant to remain invisible, laughed at her voice, silenced by poverty and cruelty. Ethan was meant to live as a pawn in a dynasty chained to obligations that killed his spirit. Yet when their paths collided, both discovered that love has the power to break the strongest chains. For American audiences who thrive on underdog stories, this tale is a reminder that greatness often comes from unexpected places. Lila's voice was born in hardship, yet it became her strength, lifting her from ridicule to reverence. Ethan's defiance cost him wealth and security, yet it gave him the freedom to live truthfully for the first time in his life. Together they proved that authenticity, no matter how costly, is worth more than any empire built on lies. The message is clear. Real love is not about wealth, status, or appearances. It is about seeing and being seen, about finding someone who calls forth the truth you were too afraid to speak. Lila sang because she could no longer stay silent. Ethan chose her because he could no longer live a lie. And in doing so, they created a life built not on duty or fear, but on courage and devotion. To every viewer, the lesson lingers. Do not let the world make you small. Do not bury your voice. And when love calls you to stand against everything you have been taught to obey, remember that the cost of silence is far greater than the price of truth. If this story touched your heart, share it with others, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more powerful love stories.